day to come and participate in this very important meeting for both the Pennsylvania State Grange, the National Grange, and the citizens of Pennsylvania. Before we get started, if we could all rise and recite the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I did have the opportunity to just read an article that was published from the meeting that they had here, I believe, on Tuesday that Secretary Redding was involved in. And the last information I had been given said that approximately 39% of the people in Pennsylvania do not have broadband. Now, the nice thing about that article was, and the information that was in it from Secretary Redding, 39%. Okay, that's not quite 50, but he put that into a number. 650,000 people in the state of Pennsylvania do not have broadband or internet access. One of the reasons that whenever we were talking about what we should do here at the farm show, that I asked Vince and Lizzie Bailey, our public relations membership consultant, to try to put this together, is I wanted this meeting to present all sides of the issue, not just one-sided. The Grange doesn't endorse any one candidate. We don't endorse any one party, but we do endorse platforms, and this is a platform that we are definitely on board with. Unfortunately, Betsy Huber, our national president, could not be here today due to illness, but Betsy is actually on a FCC commission looking into broadband. As many of you may be aware, President Trump issued some directives in the last few days. I'm sure Vince will probably bring those up. So I hope that we have a very exciting meeting, an interesting meeting. They'll open it up for questions. Please don't hesitate. And with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Vince, our legislative lobbyist and consultant here for the Pennsylvania State Grange. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. How are you? You're smiling now. I hope in an hour and a half you'll still be smiling. It's my pleasure to welcome the panel. To say very much how much I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. And of course, I want to thank you. There's no such thing as a non-busy day at the farm show, and the fact that you made room in your schedule for this also speaks very well of you, and I appreciate that very much. If I could, let me go over a couple things. First of all, as you came in, there was a packet given to you. That packet contains detailed biographical information, and also if an article has been written or in one case some testimony presented, this is just kind of a good basis for you to examine as you kind of look deeper into this issue. So please use that as an active resource, as a reference. And of course, I'm always available to tell you that I do not know the answers to your questions, but I do know people who do. And so please also let this be the start of a conversation. And of course, the Grange wants to be a partner given the fact that this issue is so important, not just to the Grange, but to everyone in rural Pennsylvania. Now, I will tell you that I went to the hearing of the House Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee the other day. And it was an informational session with Secretary Redding, and he said a couple things that really stayed with me. One was he understands the gravity of the problem and the need to make this a real priority for Pennsylvania to address. And also, and I'm putting words in his mouth a little bit, but he's not here to challenge, but oh my God, we've got it on tape now, so maybe he will see it. What he did also to suggest is that the solution is beginning to reach kind of a critical mass, where you have all the stakeholders, all the interested parties beginning to come together to say, you know, this is kind of a shared goal. How do we get there from here? And as someone who's lobbied in the halls of Harrisburg for some time, I think any time that happens, you marvel, as I do. Legislatively, that's certainly the case, where you have bipartisan cooperation with our presenter, Representative Kristin Phillips-Hill, but also her Democratic colleague, Pam Snyder. And Pam Snyder was the one at the House Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee that actually brought up the need for Pennsylvania to focus on broadband, given her experience in her district. But of course, her experience in her district is kind of like in every person, and not just legislators, but others as well. So let me give you kind of an overview of what to expect today. First of all, there is one housekeeping thing that I would ask that you use. This is so that they can get a good sound feed off of what you have to say, because there's obviously going to be interest in questions and answers, or maybe you will say something that you're working on or have a question for one of the panelists. But in order to do that, you kind of need to go to the microphone, and the microphone is located over there. So yes, there's a little bit of a traffic issue, but I hope if you'll be able to do that, just make sure that your sound comes through clearly when you get the broadcast. The other thing is that very grateful to the House Republican Communications staff for doing this. I want to thank you very much. I came here about 7:30, and you wouldn't believe what this place looked like then. I understand that it will be available. It's a live feed right now, but it will be available by contacting, I believe, your website. What is that website?
It's very easy. It's RepKristin.
RepKristin.
KRISTIN.com.
.com. So repkristin.com. Everybody got that? Okay. So this will be accessible if there's someone that you know who wanted to come but couldn't make it. This will allow them to look at it, at least in an archival sense. Now, in terms of how it's going to go, let me introduce the panelists collectively. I would ask that you hold your applause until they're all introduced. And then what I'm going to do is ask each member of the panel if there's something that they would like to say. Is there anything you'd like to say today, folks? No, not much? Okay. This could be a very short program. But and then after that, it's going to be a conversation where the panelists will talk to each other. The panelists obviously are speaking with you, and you will speak with the panelists about the things that are of interest to you, the hurdles that you've experienced, and also innovative ways or other ways of looking at how to address this problem. So, with no further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Mark Christ. Mark Christ has a pretty detailed bio, but I knew his name back when he worked as Chief of Staff for Congressman John Murtha from the Johnstown area. Murtha was a real champion for rural development in that wide, broad swath of a district, and of course Mark was his right-hand man. And Mark became U.S. Congressman, then a consultant, and in 2015 he was appointed to the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and given responsibility for revitalizing and reforming the Governor's Rural Development Council, something that hadn't been seen for some time. And so Mark Christ is here with us today. He is going to introduce our second panelist. That is not in your program. As mentioned before, Betsy took ill, a bacterial infection. She's under house arrest, kind of a quarantine situation. Don't tell her I said house arrest, but she'll see it anyway. But Mark was gracious enough to ask Mark Smith of the Governor's Office if he would be with us today, and here he is. But I'm going to ask Mark to give the formal introduction of his associate.
Thanks, Vince. One, I appreciate being here and be able to talk about a subject that's so near and dear to my heart. But really, I'm thrilled to introduce this gentleman next to me, Mark Smith. To give you a little background, as Vince described, I used to work for Jack Murtha, and one of the things that the reason our office was so efficient, or we were able to get so much done, is we relied on county commissioners to help us through their county and help prioritize different things. So a couple of years ago, I guess that was 2014, Mark and I had never met, but we both decided that we wanted to be lieutenant governor. I'm not really sure why, but here we are almost 4 years later, and our paths have brought us back together in many instances, because after we were both unsuccessful, we both helped on the governor's campaign, and the governor asked me to do rural development, and he brought Mark into his office as a special assistant because Mark, coming from a county commissioner, brings a perspective of local government and how things work. Mark was chairman of the Board of Commissioners, a very young chairman, which is unheard of, or not unheard of, but a great feat. But we know that at that level of government, it's about accomplishing things and making sure that you're getting answers and you're taking care of your constituents, and that's what Mark brought to the governor's office. So he's been a true ally of mine for rural development because he understands rural, but he has a much broader portfolio than that. But my knowledge of Mark is that when I need to get answers, when I need help, when I need to put things together and I'm having difficulties or I don't know who to go to, I frequently rely on Mark for those kind of answers. But the point of being here today is that from an administrative standpoint, in the offices and in many offices, we've been talking about rural broadband. We've been talking about broadband deployment since the governor took office, and really we know that we are in challenging budgetary times. So we frequently say, okay, well, how do we cobble together programs? How do we make sure?
Mark, can I let you have your say just a little bit later now? Thank you for the introduction.
Well,
however.
no, so I'm getting to the point.
Oh, you're getting to the point. Okay.
So we have had these discussions for several years. Well, Governor Wolf has become impatient with the time it's been taking us to come up with a strategic plan on how do we actually do rural broadband across Pennsylvania. So he has appointed Mark to be, as I've done a lot of defense work, the tip of the spear in making sure that broadband is a priority of this administration, that there is a person who is in charge and tasked with making rural broadband happen, and he will be actually even given an office and a staff, that this will happen in Pennsylvania. The governor mentioned yesterday that if he's fortunate enough to get elected for another term, by the end of his second term, he'd like to see broadband across Pennsylvania 100%. And this is the guy that's going to make it happen. So I'm thrilled because I know Mark is someone who gets stuff done. He's positioned in the right spot right next to the governor, and the governor wants to make it happen, and Mark will do that. So that's Mark Smith in a nutshell.
No pressure here, Mark. Bev Groover is a Pennsylvania native, grew up in Venango County, raised on a dairy farm, and she earned her way through school by showing Jersey cattle. Now, professionally, I know some things about her. I know that she started Asset Management Services in 1983, and she actually managed the Pennsylvania State Council of Farm Organizations for a time, and that's a group that I'm also heavily involved with. Some of her clients right now are the camp owners, the campground owners of Pennsylvania, and that's what she's going to be talking about, some of their experiences, but also the State Showmen's Association, the National Remotivation Therapy Organization, and yes, I had to ask her to tell me what that was. But also she has a strong pedigree in other association work, for example, managing the Deer Farmers of Pennsylvania and also the Livestock Association for a good number of years. She's formerly on the Farm Show Commission and currently is the president of the Allentown Fair, current secretary-treasurer of the Friends of the Farm Show Foundation, which means she could be your pipeline to get some of those cool badges that I've seen around. But I'm just saying. Okay, next presentation will be by Regina Matz, Esquire. Regina is someone who really understands the Public Utility Commission, not only because of her work with Commissioner David Sweet, but also because she has decades of experience where she's focused on this issue, where she's spent a lot of time looking at broadband-related issues and contemplating the question of how can we get that done here. And so we're glad to have you here because it'd be nice to have sort of a technical aspect as some of the things that are going on and frankly some of the impediments that the PUC has had to face to bring this priority to fruition. Representative Kristin Phillips-Hill represents Southern York County. I have to tell you that her bio is in there so you can read a little more detail about it, but I have to tell you in my working with legislators, there are some that are accessible, but some who are very approachable. Very approachable because they're looking for ideas, they're looking for solutions, they're looking to get beyond a bit of rhetoric and get into kind of rolling up your sleeves and getting the job done, and that person is Kristin Phillips-Hill. And it also speaks in a bipartisan way that she's teamed up with Democratic member Pam Snyder to meet this as a joint priority. And then there's Stephen Samara.
Hey, Vince, could I have Mark Kritz introduce me?
That concludes my introduction. Thank you very much. But enough about me, right, Steve? I like your tie. All right. Steve has been with the Pennsylvania Telephone Association since 1996. Previously, he worked in the Senate as executive director of the Senate Communications and High Technology, and also a stint as with the Senate Finance Committee. Now, that's important not only because of the high-tech emphasis of that first committee, but also if you're looking at the Senate Finance Committee work, you're looking at the realm of the financially possible as well. And I think those are two important ingredients that form a background, giving him some expertise to talk about this issue. He became the president of the Pennsylvania Telephone Association in 2008, and as you might well expect, he lobbies for that group. And also, he's presented some testimony from time to time on the subject. He has spoken to a good number of audiences, particularly those in the governor's office, as well as innumerable state legislative offices. And he's a frequent contributor to the Pennsylvania Broadband News website. Now, he also is the secretary of the Harrisburg Trade Association Executives Group and active in the Hugh O'Brien Youth Foundation. So that's our panel, folks. Shall we give them a round of applause? Bev, let's start with you.
Okay, I'm here representing, as he said, the Pennsylvania Campground Owners Association. We're a 52-year-old association. We have 232 members in Pennsylvania. We put out a campground directory which lists all our members, and we represent nearly every county in Pennsylvania. And of course, if you know anything about the campground industry, the majority of our members are in rural areas. With one exception, we do have one campground near Temple University that is simply all asphalt, and you park there if you want to, if you have a kid going to Temple and you want to visit, that kind of thing. But other than that, they're all in rural areas. Getting internet and Wi-Fi in the campground is very, very important to our customers as they come to visit a campground. We have a big problem. It used to be when I first started, and I've been in this job for many, many years, the first thing if somebody was wanting to make a reservation in a campground, they would say, do you have a swimming pool? Well, about probably 8 years ago, that switched. They now say, do you have Wi-Fi? This is what all the customers want. All the people coming to the campground want Wi-Fi. And you know what that means. They don't just have one device. They have half a dozen. Each campground, in 2013, Huffington Post did a survey that showed there were more mobile devices on this planet than there were people. And to top that off, 75% of those surveyed said they would rather go for a week without coffee than a week without Wi-Fi. This is how important it is to the traveling public. In 2016, Tango Internet did a survey of approximately 800 campgrounds across the U.S. Only 15% of those surveyed were able to provide their guests with Wi-Fi system that would support the use of all these mobile devices and streaming of the internet. Typical broadband requirements, the rule of thumb is that a campground needs 5 megabytes of bandwidth per campsite. In Pennsylvania, we have 43,000 campsites, individual sites. So you can see why this is a problem. And this doesn't make any difference if you have a tent site or if you have a $350,000 motorhome that you're pulling into a regular campsite. you definitely want internet. For years, campground owners were concerned with 3 utilities: water, electric, and sewer. Now you got to add that 4th utility, which is Wi-Fi. Sort of funny to put Wi-Fi as a utility, but that's sort of where it fits. Not only from the consumer side, but we also need it to run a campground. Almost all of our campgrounds are mom and pops. The last few years, we have had corporate move in. We have probably, of our 232 members, I think we have 18 corporate members. So, I mean, they need the Wi-Fi too, but they have a little better position to afford it. They need to have enough bandwidth to satisfy everything the campground does. These offices are run just like a business or just like an office anywhere. They need efficient, reliable service. We have campgrounds that their reservation systems won't work because they don't have internet. They may have a dial-up system, which is about, most of them have a dial-up system, but you know how slow and how that isn't the best way to go. Believe it or not, 20% of a campground reservations coming into a campground are made between midnight and 6 a.m. You think, who would ever call for a room? But think about it. How many of you in a hotel room call sometime that there's nobody there? You just call and make your reservation. Well, they're doing the same thing with campgrounds. And the camper has changed. We no longer are just that 60-year-old couple that retired and decided they were going to go on the road. We have many, many millennials camping. I think the average age now, it's down to about 34 or 36. That is drastically changing, and you know what that means: more and more people on the internet. But the reservation systems, many of them are cloud-based, and you have to have a lot of speed to get to cloud-based. You make deposits in banking, that kind of thing, they need the internet. And a lot of accounting systems. And payments to the Commonwealth. You can't even pay your sales tax or payroll taxes if you're above a certain limit unless you have internet access and can pay that way. Credit card processing. About 60% of our 60% of the reservations are credit card processing. And with that credit card processing, you need the internet. Many telephone systems are internet-based, and industry statistics are based on internet reporting. All of the statistics that we get, and I'll use the KOA system, the Campgrounds of America, which is a franchise system. All of those, they all go back to Montana, and they tell me Montana has the best system in the country for rural internet. So I don't know what they did, but they did it a long time ago. And now I'll give you some examples. We have a Snyder County campground that's about probably 7 miles from Beavertown, and they told him if he wanted internet service to go 80 feet, is how all the longer, it would cost him $20,000 plus $1,000 a month. This is impossible for a 100-site campground, which is about 85% seasonal. We have a Wayne County campground located 10 miles from Honesdale. He was told that it would have cost him $40,000 to run the lines 1 mile and then $1,000 a month. We have a Clarion County campground that's 12 miles from Clarion, and he was told there is absolutely no way that they would even consider running him internet service because he's on the other side of the river. So, you know, that's a problem. This campground is really they feel it's really holding them back and severely affecting their bottom line. In Tioga County, we have 2 campgrounds that were told to get internet access. It would be $10,000 for a half-mile of line. So my list could go on and on. The last one I'll use for an example is Fayette County. They have DSL with their cable. Their other service is 2 miles away, and the company would not even give them a price to bring fast internet to their area. So you can see this is a problem all over the state. It isn't just in one little area. So in conclusion, I want to say that 2018, something really needs to be done. Most of these campgrounds, as I mentioned, are mom and pops. Many of them are farms that were converted into campgrounds in the 60s or the 70s. Most of them, or many of them, are second generation. So we feel that these rural businesses need the same chance at making a profit as their city friends. So that's my take on this subject.
And you know, the funny thing is, too, that we could have gotten really any business group, not just campground owners, but any business group in rural Pennsylvania, and they would have given the same type of stories. One takeaway that I would ask that you think about when you consider what Bev had to say is that one of Pennsylvania's main industries, of course, is tourism. And if you build it, they will come if there is internet. If they don't have internet, maybe they'll go looking for a campground with a pool and Wi-Fi.
Right.
Mark? Which one? Oh, yeah. Mark Kritz, please.
I'd like to introduce Steve Samara. You know, and it's interesting listening to Bev because when you talk about the impact to business, it's everywhere across the state. It's not just in the northern tier. It's not just in the Susquehanna Valley. It's not just in southwest Pennsylvania. Or you can get pretty close to Erie. You can get pretty close to Harrisburg, actually, and find places that don't have it. But the way I came to my advocacy is a little bit different than some others. So, as Vince said, I worked for Jack Murtha. Jack Murtha was a defense appropriator for about 30 years. National security was top of his list. When I went to Congress, national security, defense was at the top of my list. So when I look at other countries and how the United States competes, I look at education, I look at who we're producing, what we're producing, and who we have to compete with. And what I can tell you is that India and China graduate more engineers than we have college students. So when we look at the long-term security of our country, we have to make sure that every one of our children are getting an education that they need and they're given the opportunities and the skill set to compete in a worldwide economy. And actually, being here at Farm Show, we often speak about food as a national security issue as well, because we need to feed our population and we need to make sure that we have the food infrastructure to make sure that we can feed ourselves. But when you talk about broadband, when you talk about internet access, you're not just talking about that high-speed wire and watching Netflix on TV. You're talking about education, you're talking about healthcare, you're talking about economic development, you're talking about quality of life. Rural schools have a hard time recruiting teachers, especially teachers of a high rigor. And I think at some point, instead of having that physical person in a school, which doesn't seem to be working, we're not able to do it, is that we can pipe in those high rigor courses via that wire. Many of our schools are wired for high-speed internet, but a lot of the kids, when they go home, don't have that access. So there's a gap there that we need to address. When you talk about health care, telemedicine is making huge leaps and bounds, and I'm 56 years old, and my hope at some point is that when I'm living back home in my rural area, is that when I go to my doctor's appointment, I do it on my smart TV or my computer, and that we have a consultation that happens right there, and that I don't have to drive the 30 or 40 miles to a hospital or to an office to have that exam. When you look at companies and you're trying to recruit, and this goes right to what Bev is talking about, is that they don't ask if you have internet, they ask you what speeds you have. And what we know is that if you say you don't have it, they say, well, call us when you do. So if you're trying to recruit people or companies to an area, that lack of internet access is a huge roadblock. We talked, as Vince noted, at the House Agriculture Committee hearing the other day, and broadband became a prime subject. And I talked about how, frequently we do these projects one-off. And what I mean by that is that much economic development throughout the state and actually throughout the country is project by project, is that a community or an individual or someone comes and says, we want to do this, can you help? So we at the, Mark in his previous position at the county at the state, at the federal level, we get together and we say, okay, what projects or what programs are out there that can help move this forward? So these broadband projects are very similar to that. You know, Somerset County just got an ARC grant. Mifflin County is doing a study. Kutztown area is putting in some broadband. Venango County, Chip Abramovic was down here yesterday, is doing fiber. So these are projects that we do not in consortium with other projects, is that they're project by project basis, and we help by bringing resources and expertise to the table as best we can at both the state and the federal level. When you talk about millennials, and I think Bev hit on this as well, millennials want to live and work where millennials want to live and work, but that connection is critical. This is the most wired or most connected generation that we've ever seen, and they want that connection no matter where they go. And it's becoming that, well, and I think we've moved to a point that broadband connection, high-speed internet connection, this isn't a luxury. This is a necessity. If we want to live and compete in this country, if we want to live and compete in this world, we need to be connected, and we need to have as many of our folks connected. Then we can talk about international economics. 95% of the consumers live outside this country. We need to be connected to that market if we want our economy to grow and to be sustainable. So over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of conversations going on. The Connect America Fund 2, Verizon North turned down the money that was supposed to come to Pennsylvania, and you know, initially me as being uneducated thought, oh, well, someone else will take that money. Well, it turns out that we've been lobbying for that money, and it doesn't appear that it's going to come to us without a fight. We're continuing to fight. But what that shows is that Verizon made an economic business decision. It's in their best interest. It's too expensive for them to do it. But it doesn't serve the people of Pennsylvania well, and we have to do better to bring that all together. It was interesting, Mark and I were at a function that the Penn State Extension put together, and they brought people from CoBank and Connexon to talk about how the rural electrics can do it, because they own their poles, and there's an opportunity for them to also do fiber, which would help them on smart monitoring or smart metering as well. So there's a lot of these conversations going on, and what I can say is that some of them are disjointed, but they're coming more and more under focus and within one organization to say, okay, what do we actually have, and how do we move the ball forward? And like I said, and I think I'm in 100% agreement with the governor, is that we can't look to see what we can afford. We have to look to see, where do we want to be in 10 years? Where do we want to be, well, for the governor, 5 years? Where do we want the state of Pennsylvania to be so that we are the state that we want to be? How do we make sure that our children have the opportunities and the skill sets, and how do we make sure that Pennsylvania is viable? So with that, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to, and one last thing is, Bev mentioned the Montana model. I've heard that Minnesota has a decent model. I know Alabama is doing some work. So there are other states that are doing some things that certainly could serve as a guideline. But I want to bring that all full circle, because I'm very passionate about this, and my passion revolves around education. And the governor has really put a lot more funding into education, has really started to rebuild that system. But this is a component that is part of that, and I'm really thrilled that Mark is going to be the tip of the spear in making that happen. But it's not going to be just state government. It's not going to be federal government. You know, you have Steve Severa from the Pennsylvania Telephone Association. You know, we do have the Verizons, the AT&Ts, the CenturyLinks, the Frontiers. I mean, we all, Comcast, I better not forget Comcast. We all have to pull in the same direction and find out, okay, where are the gaps, and how do we fill those gaps, and how do we make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction? So I think with the conclusion of my remarks, I think I've set it up well that Mark Smith has all the answers. One thing I can tell you, and I know Mark's going through this too, is that the more I studied this and the more I got into it, the more confused I got. This is such a complex issue, and there are so many levels of detail and so many players and so many owners and leasers. It's really not easy to get around. And then you have the competition between wired, the fiber, wired cellular, wireless, cellular, and just trying to put all those pieces together and make sure the citizens of Pennsylvania are served is really a monumental task, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I'm thrilled to be here, and I will turn it over to Mark Smith.
Here's your turn. All right. And you can say ditto, and we'll get, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark brought up a lot of great points in terms of, you know, the case for broadband, which I think we're all fairly aware in terms of the business, the healthcare, the educational impacts that this issue carries with it, and additionally, you know, the public safety aspect of it as well, and making sure that we're keeping our community safe with the latest technology. You know, in terms of what the governor wants to do, we really want to build a more statewide strategy around this issue. It's something that really every state in the country has struggled with. There's been, I wouldn't say you could pick a state and say, well, geez, they have the perfect system for building out broadband. But you know, this is an issue that the governor is committed to solving in his next term. He is personally invested in making sure that we come up with a program that works, a program that supports communities and partners with providers, and that really, you know, drives a partnership around our state agencies for this issue. You know, to do that, there's a few things that, you know, we have to do at the state to get our hands around this issue. And one of the first things that we've done in the last month is to really take a look at, you know, how do we get a real understanding of where broadband is and isn't in the state of Pennsylvania. The mapping that exists at the FCC is very broadly based. I think Regina can talk a little bit more about that in specifics. But we need to basically bring on some folks who can really drill down the data and really understand where broadband is and isn't in Pennsylvania, and then get a better understanding of how much it will actually cost to fix the problem. And I think before we move forward with a lot of talk about solutions, it's going to be important that we understand how difficult it is to solve this issue, understand how much it's actually going to cost to solve this issue. And so, you know, we've got a first few steps that we need to take to build an initiative around deployment of broadband across Pennsylvania. So, you know, I know we want to save some time for discussion, so I'll let Vince take over here, but I welcome any questions, and I'm sure there'll be a robust discussion. So thank you.
Now, the segue there was to Regina, and for good reason, because she is the person who, with Commissioner Sweet, have really worked on understanding the FCC's approach to it, has worked on trying to facilitate those federal resources that would help Pennsylvania so much. And also, her testimony does appear in here, and you'll see that it's a little bit on the technical side too, so that underscores her technical basis in understanding this issue. And Regina?
Thank you, Vince. And yes, I do feel I guess I should turn it on. Doesn't bode well for my technical capabilities. Actually, following Mark is quite ideal for me, because lately in the PUC's efforts to address this federal funding issue, I've been working extensively with them. Mark in a very compact period of time here at the very end, but Mark Kritz over a longer period of time. But I wanted to take an opportunity not only to talk about the CAF2 petition, as it's called, which is, I think, part of a handout that you all received, which is efforts at the federal level for to obtain funding. But I wanted to give a little background as well on the PUC's role in broadband. And I should state up front that I am appearing here on my own behalf. I do work for Commissioner David Sweet. But any comments I make today are on my own. If you find them particularly insightful, you can credit Commissioner Sweet. But otherwise, if they're inciting, they're all on me. So Pennsylvania has really been on the forefront, despite the tales of woe that we are hearing, and we hear you. Pennsylvania has actually been on the forefront since 1993 in pursuing broadband development. We have what's called Chapter 30 in our statutes, which was passed 3 years before the Federal Telecommunications Act of 1996 was passed. So we were way ahead of the curve on opening up the telecom markets to competition and mandating, and this is quite a unique mandate back at the time, and at that time I still qualified for the young lawyer discount in the Bar Association. I think I'm probably one of the older panelists up here today. So it has been a lot of time, but historically, Pennsylvania hit the ground running. The legislature compelled what was then the regulated telecommunications community, the folks that Steve Samara represents, your telephone company, as it was called, the incumbent local exchange carrier, which was, the predominant one at the time was Bell of Pennsylvania. You had 37 small rural ILECs that, I grew up in the Hazleton area, so I thought the phone company was Bell. I didn't realize there was such a profound existence of smaller carriers, some of whom served maybe 1,200 customers, but they were in areas where at the time voice service was not ubiquitously available. So you had the farmers who literally strung the wire from their house to their barn to get telephone service. They grew up in, can you extend it to my neighbor? Can you do this? And you had a pretty robust small rural ILEC community. But they are the broadband providers over whom the PUC can exert jurisdiction. At the time, you had 37 companies. They were required to build broadband out ubiquitously. They were given until 2015 to do so. And in exchange for doing so, they were removed from what's called rate-based rate of return regulation, which is kind of a cost-based, profit-driven. You get a return of your expenses and a return on your expenses. They were taken out of that formula, and they were tied to an inflation-based index, and they were allowed to increase their revenues purely on the rates of the change of inflation from year to year, minus at the time a productivity offset, which ranged, from 2 to 3% roughly. They were required to build out 100% by 2015, and they all have done that. Now, the problem that we're all facing today is, at the time, broadband was primarily DSL, and the statute mandated broadband defined at the time as a speed of 1.544 megabits per second. The statute at that time did not even state whether it was an asynchronous, one-way speed, was it a symmetrical two-way speed. It was determined to be a down-low speed through the legislative or the judicial process before the PUC. It was later amended in 2003 because that act had a 10-year life. And in 2003-04, the legislation sunset was reenacted. At that time, and now we're looking at a publication in 2008 called Pennsylvania, with a download speed of 1.544 and an upload speed of 128K, the most aggressive rural broadband deployment program of its kind in the nation. So Pennsylvania continued to be on the forefront of broadband deployment. It also, in the 2004 reenactment of Chapter 30, provided for certain deployment facilitators. It allowed for aggregation, broadband aggregators and aggregation funding. The ILECs, again, the only regulated entities, the rural and Verizon being the only non-rural ILEC in the state, were mandated to contribute certain funds towards this broadband education, broadband aggregation. The DCED was charged with doing mapping 5 years before the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So, and DCE does have a map of broadband availability on its website. So Pennsylvania has historically been in the forefront of mandatory broadband deployment. The problem is the technology changes so quickly and has changed so vastly since Chapter 30 was originally reenacted and then amended. But we continue to move forward, working on the legislation that we have in existence, and continue to try to facilitate the deployment of facilities that are necessary to get the signal from point A to point B. The Pennsylvania Commission has optimized public utility certifications and access to public facilities to help develop and make more robust the middle mile. So the transportation among carriers that gets you, from a region to another region. We have certificated 87 competitive access providers. Those are carriers. Those are carriers that really were not on the scene as robustly before Chapter 30 was enacted and then reenacted. The state has several statewide, what we call middle mile backbone facilities. It has the Keystone Initiative for Network-Based Education and Research, or KINBER, which is a private backbone facility that is in existence in 51 of Pennsylvania's 67 counties. We have Pennsylvania StarNet, which is a wireless facility that I believe connects all the Pennsylvania State Police barracks. They provide access on an as-available basis. We have the ability, you have the ability under Chapter 30 for municipalities to deploy broadband. A lot of people misinterpret what is a right of first refusal under Chapter 30 to be an outright ban, and it's not. At the time, again, going back to 2003-04, when Chapter 30 was reenacted, the law provided that if a municipality requested a certain type or speed of broadband, it first had to go to the incumbent LEC, again, the only regulated entity with a mandatory ubiquitous broadband obligation, and ask the ILEC to deploy that. If the ILEC refused, then the municipality was certainly entitled to go out on its own. And we have some municipalities that are doing that. I think Lancaster has done it. I think Kutztown has done it. There are others that are looking at it. It does require a concerted effort so that the money is spent wisely, which is why we're very happy to have Mark wearing the title of Broadband Czar, which I was just glad I didn't get the title of Broadband Czarina. I tell him often I don't envy his task, because there's a lot of pieces out there, and I think coordination is what we need to be at today, trying to maximize the facilities that are there so we can really get to what is called the last mile extension. And that, Betsy, Bev, is the 2-mile extension from where there are facilities to where there aren't. It's the last mile connection that is the most difficult. And you mentioned the Montana. I'm not familiar with the Montana program, but I will tell you my personal recollection of Montana when I was first out there was, it truly is the big sky country. Because you just saw the horizon, you saw the earth and the sky, and that facilitates really robust broadband. You get in Pennsylvania, and I'm just a few miles outside of town in Fishing Creek Valley, where you've got, Second Mountain and Blue Mountain, and that's the impediment. You have to deal with the topography of it. But Mark had mentioned the Verizon monies that were left on the table, and that's our most recent effort, and we've been coordinating with the governor's office of late since Mark stepped in. What happened is you have high-cost support. It's on your bills. You all see it as a federal universal service charge. It's contributing to the common good. We all contribute along the way of postal service. We all know, to send a letter to Camp Hill is a lot cheaper than mailing a letter to Alaska, but it costs the same. And that's the same concept of universal phone service and now universal broadband service. And the FCC has reorganized this high-cost support and has started making what is a very limited amount of money available on an auction basis. And to get that money, the carriers have to participate, and it's in a reverse auction, so the lower your bid to provide service to a particular census block, the greater chance of success you have, but you have to do it at a lower cost. And it comes with certain restrictions. You have to, at a minimum, provide a speed of 10 megabits download and 1 megabit per second upload. Verizon was the only, and it was Verizon North and Verizon Pennsylvania, the Verizon entity, made, I'm sure, what was an economic decision for it, that it was not going to accept this money, and it amounted to, over a 6-year period, $140 million. We review, we keep in touch with what's going on at the FCC, and we were astounded that with an order that came out in May of 2016, it appeared that the monies that were based upon unserved areas in Pennsylvania, it was an economic model that the FCC ran, We thought if any money was declined, it would stay available within the state. The FCC, which proclaims that that was the case all along, we have a different read and interpretation of their past orders, decided it would be subject to a national auction. We filed a petition in April of last year. It was actually one of the first major charges I had when I came on board with Commissioner Sweet, trying to retain access to that funds. That's the CAF2 petition that's attached to one of your handouts. We were trying to get recognition from the FCC of the efforts and the financial contributions that Pennsylvania has historically made with respect to broadband deployment. Over the period from when in 1993, when the original Chapter 30 was enacted, the ILECs really have, and it's the customers of the ILECs, along with some mandatory ILEC shareholder contributions. But we've contributed on a Commonwealth level almost $1 billion towards the deployment of broadband throughout the state. And frankly, Pennsylvania can say broadband availability is ubiquitous. Again, the trap there is the speed. What provided as a handout today is Pennsylvania Broadband Bill of Rights that's available on the PUC's website. Makes it very clear that you do have to have access. You have to be provided access to broadband within 10 business days of a request if it's not already there. It's all in the eye of the beholder of what broadband is, though. Under state law, broadband is the 1.544 download speed, which is fairly antiquated by today's standards. But to the extent you don't have access to at least that, you should have access to something a little better than I think dial-up at this point. You can contact the commission. You can file an informal complaint. But our jurisdiction is not over your price. It's not over the speed. It's over whether or not you have available broadband at the state-defined speed. So to just get back real quickly and move on to Steve and then take your questions. We did file this CAF petition in April of 2017. We had received tremendous support from our federal congresspersons, from state associations. We had, from our senators, we had both Senators Casey and Toomey file letters with the FCC. I know Senator Casey has made personal contact with FCC commissioners. We had Congressman Barletta file a letter on behalf of Congressman Thompson, Meehan, Dent, and Brady. We had Congressman Doyle, Costello, and Marino file letters at the FCC. We had excellent letters filed by state municipal associations, the Municipal League, the State Association of Township Supervisors, the State Association of Township Commissioners, the State Association of Boroughs, President of the Columbia Montour Chamber of Commerce, and we had an excellent letter filed by the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau made the point that there are 20% of the population in Pennsylvania resides in rural regions, and it's projected to grow to a significant amount of elderly citizens over the age of 65. We unfortunately got news on Wednesday of this week. We had made such tremendous inroads, I thought, at the FCC in convincing the FCC to allow us to continue to gain access to these CAF2 monies in order to recognize the contribution Pennsylvania had. But the FCC has a process where they post draft orders that they intend to enter at their next public meetings. And on Wednesday, they posted a draft order which proposes to turn down our request for relief. Essentially, they want to see more state money up front. So we're continuing to work with Mark to see what we can rally. I think the petition was filed, and then we went into a period of time where the biggest discussion on the Hill about money was how to get a budget in place. And I think that unfortunately clouded the issue at the FCC level. But we are doing what we can under the powers that are granted to us by the legislature. And again, you do have minimum rights to broadband in Pennsylvania. And if you feel you're not at least getting that, please feel free to reach out and contact the commission. Thank you.
By the way, there's a letter from the Pennsylvania State Grange to Senator Casey that kind of reinforces the efforts of the PUC and others for that end. You know, there's something going on here, though, and I just want to point it out to you. Isn't it kind of interesting that you have the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture working with the PUC? They're also working with DCED. The Department of Health has a strong interest in making sure that telemedicine is accessible. What you're seeing is that agencies who sometimes live in their silos and don't really talk with each other are beginning to come together because there's a strong perception of a very urgent common need. Now, the question is, where do we go from here? Nice that we're getting folks together, nice that everybody's talking, nice that we're looking at the extent of the problem, and also nice that we're lobbying the FCC to do the right thing. But there's a lot in Pennsylvania that rests with the General Assembly. Now, Representative Kristin Phillips-Hill and her colleague Pam Snyder have started that conversation by introducing a 4-bill package of legislation. Now, frankly, you can talk about whatever you want to talk to, but I hope your legislation will be part of that presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Kristin Phillips-Hill. I represent the 93rd District in southern York County. The district goes from south of York City all the way down to the Mason-Dixon line. It's very suburban and it gets very rural very quick. This is a problem that I've been dealing with since 2011. Now, mind you, I only took office in 2015, but I believe it was Mark Kritz who referenced the fact that working with these issues at the local level of government. I was a school board director, and the first time I heard about this issue was from a parent who called to complain and said, "You expect my child to submit their papers and turnitin.com, but we don't have enough bandwidth to get that paper uploaded to that application. What should we do?" So not long after taking office, I heard these same complaints in my more rural school districts, and I said, there's got to be something that we can do. I think it's important to just take a step back. Everybody has one of these, right? I see your heads nodding down, you're looking at them. You're, of course, Googling all these interesting facts that you're being referenced up here, right? This little device that you hold in your hand has more computing power and needs more bandwidth than your home computer and all the other devices you probably had in your home in 2004 when Act 183 went into law, right? The last time we updated Chapter 30. Folks, we have had a digital tsunami hit. And it happened over 20 years ago, and we're just figuring it out, right? We have to catch up. We have to catch up. You know, the farm bureaus here, I'm sure they can tell us, we have self-driving tractors today. Do you know that? They use GPS coordinates, they drive themselves. It must be really great. Now, it used to be a lot of work to drive a tractor. You can get a cup of coffee, you can put on some great tunes and let the tractor drive itself. We have Fitbits on cows. We have entire herds of cows that are transmitting important information about that herd. You know, how many steps did they walk? You know, all kinds of health indicators that are keeping herds of cows much healthier. It's a great thing. We're using GPS technology, you know, on tractors and other equipment to help farmers, field mapping and all kinds of great things. We're looking at sensors in the ground to tell farmers what's the mineral content, how moist is that soil, is this a good time to plant? And our farmers don't have access to enough capacity in their broadband to effectively utilize those tools. You add that to the fact that our rural students are being denied equity and access to educational resources. All of these fine people have talked about, you know, the impact to small business, taking our products to the global market. Healthcare. I spoke with WellSpan Health in York, and they said, you know, it's really hard to get these medical resources down in Delta and Brogue and Fawn, we're going to implement telemedicine. And I looked at him and I said, that's great. But can you help me get rural broadband passed? Because they're not going to have enough bandwidth to have that conference with your physician. Emergency services. We lost our 911 system in York County. How do our firefighters and EMS and police officers communicate when they don't have a 911 system? They use internet-based systems. So we have a huge issue, and we have to address this. Was at Rotary yesterday, a great organization, and they had a speaker, and a gentleman from a business in York County called York Exponential, and they have a place called the Fortress. And they really believe that small cities and rural areas deserve the same opportunities as the big cities for technology. And that tsunami that hit have created incredible changes in technology. We're seeing it being used today, right? With computer programming and artificial intelligence and robotics. And I said to him, if these technologies don't have enough broadband capacity, what happens? And he said, well, that would be like a manufacturing facility not having electricity. It just doesn't work, right? So we need to do something, and obviously this is something we're all passionate about. I'm very passionate about, and I was really fortunate to make a good friend in the legislature from a lady who lives way, way, way far away from me. But interestingly, both of our districts are on the Mason-Dixon line. And we got together and we said, you know, what can we do? And I can tell you that in the General Assembly, strength is usually in the numbers of terms of co-sponsors, of getting anything passed to solve any problems. And when you have bipartisan agreement, because folks, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is a rural Pennsylvania issue, and we all are concerned about this. You know, partnering with Representative Snyder means the governor's going to take a closer look and be more supportive. Partnering with me on her behalf means we're going to get this through the Republican legislature. And that's certainly what we intend to do. You know, Representative Snyder's district's probably a little more rural than mine. It's a little more peppered with holes in that alleged blanket of internet coverage. But we both face the same issue. So we conceived of 4 pieces of legislation, 3 resolutions. The first would conduct an in-depth investigation and audit into the compliance of non-rural telecommunication carriers with regard to Act 67 of 1993 and Act 183 of 2004. So we have this constant argument. Did those Chapter 30 changes live up to what they need to do? Did we accomplish what we needed to do? And you know, many people say yes, other people say no. Here's what we know. While we may not be getting that money through the FCC, we do know that down at the National Farm Bureau meeting in Tennessee, President Trump signed an executive order, and this is priority 1. Secretary Perdue, Sonny Perdue, chaired a task force. 100 recommendations came out of that task force on how to lift up and bring prosperity to rural America. Rural broadband access to high-speed internet was what rose to the top as being the most important out of all those 100 recommendations from the task force. If we're going to get federal money, we need to make sure that what we've done in the past works, because we don't want to repeat our mistakes. And I think it was Mark Kritz who made a reference and said that, you know, we can't look at what we can afford. Folks, we have to look at what we can afford. Unfortunately, none of you sitting out in this audience has a money tree farm up in the northern tier. Until we find someone who can farm that for us, we always have to be mindful of what we can afford. And I would say the other thing, Mark, I know that you're talking about the next term. I don't think, and I hate to put words in people's mouths, but I don't think that we can wait that long. I don't know if Representative Snyder would think that we can wait that long. We need to move now, because we know that that federal action is coming. The next piece of legislation would establish a special bipartisan bicameral legislative commission that would recommend improvements to the deployment of high-speed broadband services in those unserved and underserved areas. We're looking, we have a bill that would inventory all State Department, agency, commission, or institution-owned communication towers, poles, buildings, facilities, all of our state assets, rights-of-ways, to leverage existing state-owned assets for the provisioning of high-speed broadband. Right? We're a pretty diverse state from a geographical point of view and a topographical point of view. What works to get it high-speed internet to farms in Chester County is not going to work to get high-speed internet to farms in Fayette County or Tioga County. We're going to need companies who have different approaches to deploying those resources. But I think that, you know, the federal government, the state government, counties and municipalities all need to work together. And then lastly, we're auditing the Pennsylvania Department of Education's administration of the E-Fund, which is a 6-year education technology program that was to address network modernization plans, right? This is the money that brought that high-speed internet to your school district, which is why you see flocks of cars in the evenings with moms and cups of coffee and kids with laptops getting their homework done, because that's where they can get their high-speed internet. You know, I would say that additionally, Representative Snyder and I have been in conversations with the Microsoft Corporation. We hosted a meeting with Microsoft. They brought their representatives in, met with many legislators from all across the Commonwealth, and we wanted to make clear to them that Pennsylvania is interested in participating in their plan to close the internet gap by bridging broadband connectivity to over 2 million people in rural America. They have a program where they have purchased spectrum, the white space that was freed up when we went to digital television, the way we used to broadcast the old analog television, and they are using that as a means of deploying high-speed internet. And you know, we're looking for every type of solution. Free market solutions are always best, and should their plan be successful and subsequently expanded, we wanted them to know that Pennsylvania would be very interested in you know, working with them, combining private sector capital investments in new technologies with public sector support. So, you know, as we said, the President has indicated that for our rural regions, his infrastructure proposal would distribute block grants for infrastructure, including broadband investments. I think, you know, we are already talking with members on both sides of the aisle from our congressional delegation to make sure that that comes to fruition. Congressman Schuster is going to be spearheading that effort. He represents that rural southwestern corner, and I think he really gets it. So federal action combined with state action combined with better data collection about rural broadband coverage will really assist policymakers and the private sector as they make decisions on how to invest their resources to eliminate our rural broadband gap. And as I said before, government working at every level together is going to assure a positive environment for making broadband access in rural Pennsylvania and across the rural parts of this country. That access will become a reality. So what I can tell you is that this year in 2018, you know, Representative Snyder and I are going to continue to push for passage of all of the bills and resolutions in that package of legislation we put together, and we are going to proactively seek other initiatives and opportunities, private sector, public sector, to bring high-speed broadband internet accessibility, right, to all of our constituents and everyone who resides in the Commonwealth. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you being here today.
Kind of a funny thing. I read her bill on Pam Snyder's bill on the inventory of state-owned poles, et cetera, infrastructure, before Donald Trump issued his executive order on January the 8th. So I'm inclined to believe that he probably got that good idea from Pennsylvania somewhere. Okay. One of the things that I really noted, though, is in terms of we can't do it alone. That is, one agency can't do it alone. The General Assembly can do an awful lot, but when you come right down to it, it can't do what it has to do by itself either. The word that came out was partnership. So a public-private partnership. Now, of course, on the private side of that partnership is the Pennsylvania Telephone Association. And of course, Steve Samara will talk a bit about some of the work done by the Telephone Association to promote this goal. And also, I was particularly intrigued when the phrasing, we need companies with different approaches because putting in access to Chester County is going to simply be different than putting it in another part of the state. Steve?
Thanks, Vince. I want to thank you and Wayne and the Grange for putting this together. We can't talk enough about this issue, and obviously if you've learned anything from my previous panelists, there's a disconnect from what we've done and what people want. A little bit about PTA. I represent all the rural local exchange carriers in Pennsylvania. That's the RLECs. That is CenturyLink, Frontier, Windstream. We have a couple 100,000 access lines all the way down to true mom and pops that have maybe 1,000 access lines. They have a common denominator, which is they're serving rural, sparsely populated areas, expensive to serve areas. And I think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about Bev's constituents. We're talking about the folks who live outside of Harrisburg, live outside of Carlisle, live outside of Gettysburg, that my folks are serving. Gina did a very nice job of talking about what we've done on broadband in Pennsylvania. 1.544 is not enough for a lot of people. It's plenty for others. When I was out at Representative Pam Snyder's event, at the House Consumer Affairs Committee meeting out in Waynesburg, we talked a little bit about what is broadband, what are people's expectations. I caution all of you to take a step back, and when you hear a number that says this amount of Pennsylvanians doesn't have access to broadband, what broadband is. Broadband at the state level is 1.544 meg. Broadband at the federal level is 25 meg. Broadband at the federal level, if you're taking Connect America Fund money, is 10 meg. So take a step back. I'm not saying there's not an issue. There is an issue. Obviously, we've heard people want it and can't get it. But you need to take a step back and look at. So the folks that are doing mapping, that are taking a look at what is out there, Representative Phillips-Hill bill, and what Mark Smith is looking at from the governor's perspective is where is the need and what is that need. So I would caution you to take a step back and think about before you hear a huge number, because honestly, the FCC does a broadband report every year. A couple years ago, the definition of broadband changed from 10 meg to 25 meg. All of a sudden, there was a crisis. This is how many people don't have access to broadband now, because they may have 10, but they don't have 25. So I'm not saying it's a made-up number, but you need to put it all in perspective. So, like I said, we've done a good job here. We've been at the forefront in Pennsylvania. There are no excuses. We don't need to feel bad about what we've done here just because 1.544 isn't what most people want anymore. We are the first state that did a universal broadband availability law. I think we're the only state that still has one on the books. Most of my member companies hit that bogey by 2013, some well before that. And all of them are going well beyond that 1.544. It's not like you got to that, that bogey and you stopped. Just didn't happen because, as has been referenced here earlier, 2004 was a long time ago. And we've done a lot of things since then as an industry, and the technology has changed so dramatically that people are requesting more and more speed. And we love to get that speed out there to people. I will tell you that take rates for a variety of speeds amongst my member companies is not what we'd like it to be. It's not a attractive or sexy from a public policy perspective thing to say, hey, a lot of people want 1.544. A lot of people do want 1.544. Some people need 10. Some people need 100 meg. It's a whole wide range of what people want and what people need. We love to serve those people. We enjoy serving those people. These are landline customers. How many folks in the room still have a landline telephone? Okay. that base of customers is shrinking. Surprise, surprise. We don't need to stop the presses on that one. We're going wireless. We're going different ways. These guys are, these RLECs are reinventing themselves to compete in today's economy, but they're still providers of last resort. So if you move into the middle of nowhere and want a landline, you get a landline. It doesn't matter how much it costs to get it there. You will get a landline, and you will get dial tone to dial 911 to do everything you need to do on a landline. If you want broadband in the middle of nowhere, you're getting 1.544 within 10 business days from one of my member companies. We're the only part of the industry that has to meet that bogey. And that doesn't come without a cost. And that is what my folks are up against. The rural local telephone companies in this state have witnessed from the FCC and the feds a dramatically reduced support for landline telephony and keeping that landline telephony affordable. It started in 2011. It's not getting any better. What you hear about the Connect America Fund or money going to broadband is not found money. This is not, oh, you've done landline, thanks very much, we now need you to do broadband. It's not new money. They're not throwing money at the problem just to make it go away. And if you look at the Connect America Fund and some of the other funds that are out there to help these guys provide broadband, even the feds recognize that even the highest cost areas, they're not going to send money there. They are not going to send money to the highest cost areas to serve, because it doesn't make sense for the taxpayers across this country to send money to the middle of nowhere so that someone can have broadband. And so that's what my guys are facing. So we've been talking to Mark Kritz for years. We've been talking to Mark Smith just recently. I'm glad there's an effort at the state level to do broadband. About half the states in the country have a broadband office that are looking at this. About a quarter of the states in the country have some sort of funding mechanism to make sure that broadband gets out there a little bit further. And probably 2 states have what I would consider a significant effort to help companies get broadband out there. So this is just getting the ball rolling. And I don't want to say, well, if we had the money, we could do it. But honestly, at the end of the day, my member companies are serving the uneconomic areas to serve in this Commonwealth. It's expensive to supply landline and dial tone service to those areas, and now we're talking broadband on top of that. So we'd love to get the take rates up. We'd love to get more people interested in it. Education is part of it. But it's a very difficult nut to crack, and I hope we can get there. But on behalf of PTA and the local exchange carriers, we're here to work with anyone who has ideas. And like I said, I think with the 2 Marks here and with Representative Phillips-Hill and Bev and Gina and all the folks in the room together, we can get to some answers. But with that, happy to take any questions anyone has. Thanks, Vince.
Okay. Well, let me start out with the first question, just to kind of get the conversational ball rolling. Talked about a couple things and voiced by the speakers in different ways. One is we need a clearer picture of what the landscape is. Secondly, we need a commitment, which I think we now pretty much have. We also need, in some way, to address the economics, whether it be the economics as voiced by the state budget and the difficulties in enacting a budget, or other resources, whether it be public or private sector. So I would ask the panelists to talk a little bit about how you feel that Pennsylvania can address the economics of the issue that would tend to make broadband access more feasible. I thought I'd start with an easy question.
Yeah, well, I'll just talk a little bit about it in terms of, I think the two, with Mark saying, we got to focus on what we need to do, not what we can afford to do, and I think the representative saying, hey, we need to focus on, what we can afford to do, and I think we need to be a little bit more realistic about what this problem is. And when I said earlier about, what we need to do to understand where this problem doesn't exist, is because you have to have that before you can say how much this problem costs to fix and how you can better work with folks under Steve's purview and really get our agencies squared away on what we need to do and develop priorities. But let's as a good example, take a look at what New York State has done. Now they've promised 98% broadband availability across the state. They're also going to spend, probably by the time they're done, $750 million to $1 billion to do that. So it's good to have an aggressive approach, I think, from the legislature. They want to do this problem, and it's good to, to hear folks on the administration side that want to, solve this problem, and the governor wants to be aggressive too. But it's going to be really important for us to talk about this in the reality that it is and what it costs. And we don't really know that. And that's going to be really important for that conversation, I think, over the course of the next year to take place. And I think in terms of, the governor's urgency on this issue, he really wants to do this. I think if you look at where we've been in Pennsylvania over the years, this is decades long that this has gone on. The governor has some aggressive goals, so I think the representative wants to do something now. She wants the governor to do something now. He is doing something now. We're creating a broadband office to focus specifically on this issue, to work with the legislature, to work with all our state agencies, to work with our stakeholders like Steve and our partners at the PUC, to really wrap our hands around this issue and figure out a way forward that is reasonable and doable. But also really aggressive and gets the service to the people who need it, especially in rural parts of the state where businesses and agriculture and our residents need it for education and health care and the things we need to do. So we are being very aggressive about it. I think there's some steps up front that we need to take. I think even in terms of the inventory that the representatives are looking for, we've sort of built that out, and we can share that information with them, I think, at this point. So there are things moving, but we've got some work to do.
Can I jump in and just expound a little bit on the New York project that Mark mentioned? Because I agree, getting a clearer picture of the landscape is critical. We need to know what's out there. We don't need to duplicate efforts. We need to maximize what's already in existence. And we do need the commitment, which I'm seeing today, but it always comes down to money. And it's the money involved in getting this out there that is so critical, which is why we were pursuing things at the FCC. What New York did, they had a $4 billion settlement through their Attorney General coming out of a fine against businesses who were doing business with states that sponsored terrorist groups. What they did was they took $500 million out of that settlement and dedicated it to a broadband fund. When Verizon declined this universal service support, they did it in all their territories. They didn't just decline in Pennsylvania. They made a business decision. As Steve said, they are businesses. $170 million was declined in New York. Well, New York went to the FCC and said, we will match dollar for dollar the $170 million that you had by a cost model said would be available for the Verizon census blocks that are underserved. Will you, if we show up with $170 million, will you give us access to that money? And the FCC said yes. Now, New York also had an auction process, a reverse auction process, which would have matched the FCC's process. So the FCC felt comfortable because it was getting a present dollar, not past dollars, because Pennsylvania has had a commitment and money that went into it. But they were looking at, what are you doing for me today? Well, New York today was dedicating $500 million towards getting broadband out there, and the FCC said, you do that, you match our parameters through your own auction process, we'll give you access to that money. We tried to do that, but we don't have $500 million. Verizon declined $140 million in Pennsylvania. We didn't have $140 million. Now, that's not $140 million up front. It's $24 million, roughly, over a 6-year period. But we tried to, there's a saying in the law, if you have the facts, you argue the facts. If you don't have the facts, you argue the law. If you don't have either, you pound the table. Well, we did a lot. I thought we did more than pound the table at the FCC. Quite honestly, I thought we put together a very good argument to justify the FCC's treating Pennsylvania the same way it treated New York. The only difference was we weren't going there with a dedicated pot of money, but we were saying we have a very strong history of public-private partnerships where the state and the industry combined resources and made it happen at 1.544, but made it happen. DCED has grants that are eligible for some sort of broadband deployment. The governor did commit to $100,000. He, during this budgetary process, found some money. I tried to go through my sofa cushions and see what I can contribute, but we tried to argue before the FCC, if we show up. So we don't have this money up front we can dedicate, but if we show up with some, will you give us a consideration in the auction? And basically the FCC came back paragraph after paragraph addressing our argument and said, but you see what they did in New York. You see what they did in New York. New York showed up with that money up front. That's what the FCC wants to see. We're still reviewing, and the order hasn't been entered yet. It's a draft. We're still reviewing what options we may have before or after January 30th. But $140 million is probably a drop in the bucket compared to what we're going to need to get broadband at today's speeds throughout all of Pennsylvania. But if you have 140 out there that you can tag, if you just show up with some, it goes a long way to do it. But it comes down to, I would reverse the order of your points. It's the economics first, because public-private partnership, whatever you do, it comes down to the money, and that's what's needed in Pennsylvania.
So getting back to what Mark said, as Representative Snyder and I delved into this issue, there's a reason why we looked at two specific resolutions. One, we don't know the full extent of the issue that we are dealing with, right? So much of the information that we have is very anecdotal. Our data at DCED, I show constituent maps. I did a survey down in the far southeastern portion of my district, and the 75% of the people who saw those maps disagreed with what we have. We don't have good, accurate data to make decisions on, right? And what are our true needs, right? So in 2004, 1.544 was good, right? Now we find out the federal standard is 25. Where are we going to need to be? And we have to lay that all out. So, I think that is why we believe we need a bipartisan, bicameral commission to work through these things so that we can have these conversations. And February 6th, Governor will show up in the House again and present his budget, and we're going to have to work through that process and see what we can allocate, recognizing that we've had some really intense financial challenges. So I think recognizing it, figuring out what it is we truly need, getting the right data will help us make the best informed decisions that we possibly can, and looking at what we have done in the past so that we can replicate what we've done well and we don't make the same mistakes again in the future are really important.
Other thoughts from the panel? Okay, now it's your turn. And if I could ask the questioner to please identify themselves to the panel as well.
I'd like to thank Pennsylvania State Grange and our legislative director, Vince, for putting together this absolutely excellent panel to elucidate us on this, what's happening on this whole field. But I have a few comments. A few years ago, actually many years ago, our representative was determined to make our very rural area in Lycoming County have the first DSL service. And he said we needed 50 signatures. So I went out and got those 50 signatures, and eventually then, the excitement was watching the telephone line get bigger. I don't know the mechanics of all that, but we were all watching as it came out mile by mile and hopeful, and eventually we did get that service. As an owner of a small graphics and photo restoration business, I had a very difficult time before I got that service. If I wanted to send a project out to California, I had to really dumb down that project. and in fact divide it into sections and send it out there. I would send a section, and then I could make calls to other clients. I could go do the laundry, feed the dog, do some sweeping, whatever, waiting for that project to get out there, because meanwhile I couldn't do anything else on the computer. So that was very, very difficult to conduct a business. I appreciate your comments, Representative, on the farming. Eventually we stopped farming, and the individual who is now farming is having a lot of difficulty because, like you said, he's got this modern equipment, but he can't really utilize it. He gave me a ride one day in the, one of these huge pieces of equipment that, you know, cost as much as a house practically, and he couldn't, harvesting corn, so whatever that's called. And he had all this fancy equipment on board that he could be utilizing, that would tell him what's in the soil, the content of the soil, and what this piece of soil needed, what this piece needed, etc. But he couldn't use it. He couldn't access it because he didn't have enough broadband. I'll tell you that at home right now, I have 1 megabyte of download and 3/4 of upload. I'm also concerned, one of you mentioned about the medical aspect. That's really critical. Those of us who depend on calling our doctor and getting input, or we have medical equipment in our home that needs to report to the doctors on our medical conditions, that is deteriorating significantly. And it's rather frightening to me and to older people in the community. I had a 96, she's 93 now, but at the time she was 86, and she loved working on the computer. Now, it was primarily to keep in contact with relatives from Alaska all over the country, but at least it gave her that, that contact with those people. And I will tell you, she also enjoyed playing different games on it that came in. But still, it would frustrate her that she couldn't get the speed. She couldn't do the things she wanted to. So she would poke around with different buttons, and about every other day I'd go down and fix it. And then a few days later, she'd be poking around with buttons, and I'd have to go back down again. Here again, it was because of speed. Something else I wanted to tell you, the last thing I wanted to comment on is recently there is a little substation on our farm that Verizon has. Recently, I've been wanting to contact them, and finally one day driving by, there was actually a truck in the driveway of this little area, and the door was open. Usually the door is closed and locked. And I thought, yes. So I went inside, or not inside, but, made enough noise that the gentleman came out. And he took me in. I expressed my frustration. He took me inside this building. It's almost empty, because he said he was there that day to pull out another chunk. They are gradually deteriorating not only the service we get for our internet, but the landline. And his comment was that Verizon, he didn't like the system, but his comment was that Verizon was losing money in our rural areas, that they could service urban areas and make a lot more money than they could in our rural areas. So I just wanted to make those comments. Oh, and I also want to know, what can we do as citizens? I'd like you to talk to us about what all of us could be doing as citizens to assist you in what you're trying to acquire. Thank you very much.
I'll take a swing at that one, Vince, if you don't mind. I think the program that you led off with was the Bonafide Retail Request Program, which was in Act 183, where people demonstrate an interest in and need, and then a company came out and built to you. That unfortunately expired under Act 183 when we kind of met that threshold, but I think that concept has some merit to it going forward, and I think in talking to the Marks and other folks here, it's what my member companies need to see. I mean, there needs to be some demonstrated interest in signing up for the service. because you see these maps of unserved or underserved areas, and you can map until you're blue in the face and tell me what isn't served, but the map doesn't show you how many people in that area want the service. So that feedback from customers was great, because it gave, from a financial perspective, it gave my member companies the comfort that they could build out and at least have you on the service for a year. I mean, that was all the guarantee was. You'd sign up for a year. And right now we go and build and in many cases hope that people sign up for the service, and they could have it for a couple months and go somewhere else. But because we're providers of last resort with landline, we're out building where people are. Whether they take the service and keep the service ultimately is another question entirely. But I think that notion of the bona fide retail request was a good notion. It was unique. It quite frankly got panned a little bit when we had Act 183 running, because everyone said, well, no one's going to do that. No one's going to get their neighbors to go and go to a company and say, hey, we want the service. But it worked really well. And I think we need some of that going forward, quite frankly. I think that would help the rural phone companies in the state, help to identify where there is a need for the service, because we have service out with, honestly, the difference between 1 meg, 3 meg, 5 meg, and 10 meg, those prices are kind of compressed now. So we have a pretty good idea what people want from where the feet meet the street, what people are signing up for. But we need feedback from you. So your last point about what can citizens do, I think that's a mechanism that if we could get that worked into something going forward, we would have an idea of what citizens want. And I don't know what your neighbors want. You're in a rural area. Maybe you want 100 meg. Maybe Mrs. Jones down the street is not interested in it at all. So if we build everywhere, we get you signed up as a customer, and we don't get anyone else signed up as a customer. So but I think from a citizen's perspective, that would be important for you. And if you had a mechanism to tell the companies that you'd be interested in signing up, that would be helpful. So thanks.
And if I could just add, your state representative is Jeff Wheeland, and I'm sure he would probably love to hear from you. I know that I do a much better job representing the people back home in my district when they communicate their concerns and their needs to me. So, take the time, and we're always happy to hear from folks however they want to communicate with us, whether it's a phone call, an email, a handwritten letter, but let them know.
And if I can, I just have 2 points to make. Number one, please pick up one of the Broadband Bill of Rights handouts that was on the table. Our jurisdiction is limited over broadband, but we do have jurisdiction to ensure that you are getting what Chapter 30 required. So please look into that. If you feel you're not getting the 1.54 that you're entitled to, then there are avenues that you could reach out to at the PUC to discuss that. And the other point I just wanted to make is Lycoming County is one of the, we made this argument in our CAF2 petition about not creating an intra-county digital divide, because digital divide is one of those buzzwords that everybody, throws out as, well, we don't, that's the disconnect between the rural and the suburban and the urban areas. But in your county, you have Frontier, Verizon, and Windstream that all provide regulated service. The amount of money that was declined in Lycoming County by Verizon, which we were trying to retain access to for use in Pennsylvania, was $1.3 million per year. So almost $8 million. My math is, which is not always right, but 1.3 times 6 is what we're trying to save for use in Lycoming County. It's one of the higher counties in terms of lost access to CAF revenues. And thank you for your comments.
Well, an awful lot of the conversation, though, does kind of get around to who has what level of service, if any. And Regina mentioned that the Bill of Rights guarantees access. But I was talking to a gentleman the other day who lives very close to Harrisburg and said that he doesn't believe the maps. He doesn't believe the maps because he doesn't have access. There may be providers, but there's no access for him where he lives, and he lives less than 10 miles from Harrisburg in northern York County. So would you all like to comment on what it would take to make a more accurate picture of what's actually going on down there? That was a very bad question to ask. However, you know, King Whetstone...
I have a question, Vince.
Oh, please.
So as we talk about speeds, you know, the Act 183 set it at 1.544, and Steve Samara and the rural telephones, I mean, they do a wonderful job. They have, you know, some of the toughest terrain, least cost areas that they cover, and they serve those areas well. And as we look to the future, if we changed the definition of broadband in Pennsylvania legislatively to 25.3, what would that mean to your members, Steve?
I think, as I mentioned before, with when the FCC changed their definition for their broadband report, it meant hundreds of millions of, I don't know what the number was, tens of millions of U.S. citizens didn't have broadband all of a sudden, so, which was a bit of a misnomer. And when I see a map, and I take exception to a lot of the maps that are out there, because when we did Act 183 and worked with DCED, they said, well, we got to color in these maps. I said, well, color them in. I said, my guys have to deploy everywhere. It's a universal mandate. Well, we can't color in where there's a lake. I said, well, you know, but if someone got a houseboat and went out there and dropped an anchor and wanted broadband, they'd get it. I said, so color it in. So we had lots of discussions about maps, but I don't know what it would do, Mark. I mean, I think what you need to do at the end of the day is find out what people want and determine where there truly is an underserved community, and work together to try and find a way to support doing that in uneconomic areas of the Commonwealth. You can make the definition 100 meg. I mean, you can make it whatever you want, and some people want that, and we're happy to serve those people. But there are folks that don't either. So the definition, I think, is irrelevant from my viewpoint, other than I don't want someone to change the definition and then point at my member companies and say, what have you been doing? I don't want to be thrown in that mix of, you haven't done anything since 2000. You hit 1.544 and you quit. You met the statutory mandate and you didn't go any further, because no one's more sensitive to market demands than my member companies. They know what customers want, and they provide that service at a reasonable price to anyone who wants it. So.
Well, and I was driving more at, what if your companies were mandated to do 25.3? Would that, the infrastructure costs for your companies, would that, or is it still just the demand?
It would be, I can't put a price tag on it. I've seen price tags to get to the FCC definition nationally of $80 billion to get to that threshold. So Pennsylvania would be some subset of that. So you talk about $1 million here, $1 million there, when it costs us hundreds of thousands per mile to deploy fiber. It seems like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to sign up. You know, the map's not going to look much different, quite frankly. So we're talking billions of dollars nationally, and some subset of that in Pennsylvania. So.
But if you adopt the suggestion and one of the bills to utilize the state's inventory, excuse me, of poles and other infrastructure devices, would that allow the private sector companies to kind of piggyback on that? Would that reduce their operating costs to providing that access to underserved areas? Steve?
Yeah, Vince, I think you make a good point. And it's a point that kind of gets lost when we talk about broadband and all the bells and whistles. We have a great network here, thanks to the rural local exchange carriers and Verizon, your traditional landline carriers, and you need that network in place to do all the bells and whistles of broadband. They're not separate networks. We do have the StarNet that was mentioned before, and Kimber has come in and deployed some fiber, and I know FirstNet now for the first responders network is going to be up and running here in the next couple of years. So the infrastructure is there to do a lot of the things you want to do, but you can't neglect that infrastructure and expect to get all the fun stuff that you get from the internet. And that's what I alluded to before. The FCC is significantly moving support away from those traditional networks and moving it into broadband, and you just can't make that step without expecting something bad to happen on the broadband of things, because you need again, not sexy, not fun, not interesting to a lot of people. It is to me because I do it every day. But that landline network that many of you aren't using anymore, guess what? You need that to get on the internet. And if we lose support for that network, you're not going to get all the fun stuff that people want to do, whether it's gaming or running a business or whatever. So you need that traditional landline network to get that done.
Although I should point out that Senator Ryan Allment has a bill in that would allow the continuance of the Universal Service Fund in Pennsylvania to, I think, 2024 as a way to preserve landline access. 2022 as a way to preserve landline access, at least until we can kind of figure out what to do to bring the digital age to underserved Pennsylvania. Now, Bev, I have a question for you. In terms of the company owners, the campground company owners, you mentioned some statistics as to what it would cost them to truly be connected. And of course, when I hear figures like 20,000 up to 100,000, that usually gets my attention. Are the members of your association looking to the state for any particular solution or asking the state to examine something that would allow them to reduce that connection cost?
They really have not. We didn't even have these figures till you asked me to be on this panel, and then we started checking, and it really is much worse than we thought it was. So, I mean, yes, this comes up at conventions and meetings, and what are you doing? And I know there's one campground in Erie County that paid $100,000, but they're a big campground. Not that they could afford $100,000, but they brought a company in there and got what they needed, but it isn't a cheap deal. So,
okay. Well, the bottom line is we've just scratched the surface, haven't we? There's a lot more to this issue than we could talk about until the cows come home. But in the meantime,
thank you. Just a comment. Thank you all for your comments. Appreciate this discussion today. I'm Kristin Caldera. I'm with the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. If you're not familiar with the Center, we're a legislative research agency. We're bicameral, bipartisan. We look at all kinds of rural issues, and of course, broadband is topping the list right now. In 2018, this year, the Center is sponsoring a research project with our partners at Penn State University to look at broadband access and availability in rural Pennsylvania. We are using a definition of the 25.3, and that's kind of like the Netflix standard of what we understand for folks to stream Netflix. So we're hoping that definition kind of addresses, some level of speed that folks need to access, upload, download, all that kind of good stuff. So when that is completed, the research is completed, we share it with the legislature, with the administration, and with the public to let you know what data we found, and our next step, hopefully, will be on affordability. So we're taking it kind of a step at a time. So right now we're looking at the actual access, hope to do affordability, potentially, possibly next year or so. But thank you so much.
Before you sit down,
Sure.
do you have anticipated dates of when you'll have this research completed and ready to be published?
Yeah, it looks like 2019, early 2019. Okay. This is a year-long research project. Okay. And like I said, the faculty member out of Penn State is starting now. So it is getting kicked off.
Fantastic. We will look very much forward to that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Share it with you.
Now,
thank you.
Don't go just yet,
Okay.
because I have a question for you.
Sure.
Yesterday, Governor Wolf talked about the opioid crisis in Pennsylvania and kind of escalated the level of danger. But that's been brewing for a long time, and the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, with its hearings, et cetera, really helped raise the public visibility and understanding of the issue. Is this something that the center is contemplating on the broadband issue?
Contemplating
a series of public hearings and forums?
We are discussing that now. Our board is talking about that at this point, so that is potentially something we will be looking at in the coming year.
Because I think they did really set a good floor for people to start moving on the opioid crisis.
Yes, thank
Just
you.
my
Our
thought.
chairman was, Chairman Yaw was very influential in our board to get that issue out to the public, so thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One last thing, because it's almost quitting time. And King Whetstone with the National Agricultural Statistics Service, at the start of the session, he handed me a document called Farmers Are Using Additional Methods to Access the Internet. It's actually the second study that NAS has done on the actual usage. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe I do. Is this something you'd like to share with the group, some of the findings?
Well, thanks, Vince, and appreciate that. And so that information, the computer usage, NAS does collect that data. And for people that are not familiar with NAS, we're USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service. So our scope is farmers and ranchers. And so we survey farmers and ranchers about their use of internet and computer usage. And the handout that I brought will tell you the information that we found. Now, the 2013, 15, and 17 data is based on a sample, but in 2012 we did a census and gathered some limited data from farmers and ranchers and how often or how they're accessing the internet. But for the 2017 census, which we just mailed out in December, we're going to go into a little bit more detail information on their computer usage and how they're using the computer, and so that will be very helpful for the census. So if you can, encourage any farmers or ranchers when they get that report to respond, that information will come out in 2019, February 2019, about the coverage of internet usage amongst farmers and ranchers. Why it's so critical for Pennsylvania is because they're the #1 state as far as direct marketing when it comes to products. And when you're direct marketing your products, you're advantageous to promote it through the internet. And so getting this discussion is probably very helpful, especially for a rural area, because of how intense that they're using direct marketing to promote their products. So but if any information, any helpful encouragement or promotion you can help us with to get the farmers and ranchers to respond to the census, so we can true up our data when it comes to how they're using the computer and how they're accessing the internet.
In addition to the fact that it'll provide a new data basis, as some of the policymakers in Harrisburg and the governor's office begin to look at the problem and begin to look at levels of usage and from the people themselves. So I think it would be a useful complement to other statistical analyses that maybe others in the panel would like to undertake. So thank you very much.
Yeah. And I do have about 20 handouts.
Okay. And now, the time has come. There's a start, there's an end, although with this discussion there is no end. But for today, there is a short pause until the next conversation on broadband. I, for one, would like to thank the members of the panel very much for giving us their day and their time and their expertise and their insights. A lot of ideas and a lot of thinking that goes into what each one said. And of course, I hope this also spurred some thought on your side. I would offer the Pennsylvania State Grange as a resource. If you want to contact one of our panelists directly, please feel free to reach out to me or Lizzie or Wayne, and we'll make sure that you get in touch with the person you want to talk to. Or if you just have an idea you'd like us to pass along, we'll be very happy to share that with all. This whole issue is probably the top legislative issue for the Pennsylvania State Grange, which is why Wayne felt it was critical for us to have that as a program this year. So bottom line is, thank you very much.